Ford built a legend almost by accident. Opel refused to accept that. Every inch of the Manta was drawn for one purpose: humiliate the Capri on its rival's own turf. That kind of single-minded obsession should have crippled the project before it reached any showroom. Instead, something unexpected happened. The same stubbornness that worried the company's own board became the reason collectors now chase this coupe, decades after the safer German-built bet faded from most driveways. Comment below, did your family ever pick a side in this rivalry? Then let's rewind to where the fight actually started. Rüsselsheim in the late 1960s ran on a very specific kind of anxiety. Opel's parent company, General Motors, had watched Ford's European division post sales figures that embarrassed almost everyone else on the continent. Cologne's showrooms moved Capris faster than dealers could restock them. Executives in Detroit noticed. Executives in Rüsselsheim felt that attention landed directly on their shoulders. Nothing about the Capri's success came from luck. Ford had studied American muscle car marketing for years, then translated that formula for European roads and European wallets. Long hood, short deck, a sporty silhouette wrapped around ordinary, affordable mechanicals. Buyers who could never afford a Mustang suddenly had a European version parked in their own price range. It worked exactly as designed. Opel's own lineup, by comparison, looked stubbornly sensible. Cadets and Records sold reliably enough, but reliability wasn't what young European buyers were chasing anymore. A generation raised on post-war rationing now had disposable income for the first time, and that generation wanted a car that looked like a decision, not a necessity. Ford understood that shift early. Opel understood it late, and understanding it late meant playing catch-up against a rival who'd already claimed the entire conversation. Board meetings during this period reportedly grew tense in ways that rarely happened at Opel. One argument surfaced again and again: build something close enough to the Capri to compete, or build something different enough to stand apart. Half the room wanted safety, half wanted a genuine fight. Neither side fully won, and that tension shaped almost every decision that followed. What GM Europe eventually greenlit split the difference in a way nobody at Ford would have risked. The Manta needed the Capri's basic formula: coupe body, familiar mechanicals, an attainable price, but Opel's engineers pushed for sharper handling and a tighter, more purposeful stance than Ford's design ever attempted. Where the Capri leaned toward broad appeal, comfortable for a wide range of buyers, the Manta leaned toward something narrower and more deliberate. That difference wasn't accidental. Ford had built the Capri to protect volume, spreading its appeal across as many buyers as possible without alienating anyone. Opel, chasing from behind, didn't have that luxury. A car built purely to win back attention couldn't afford to be everything to everyone. It had to be sharp enough that someone crossing a Ford showroom floor would stop, reconsider, and walk toward Rüsselsheim's badge instead. Engineers pursuing that sharper feel made choices Ford's more conservative approach never risked. Suspension geometry got tuned closer to what privateer racers actually wanted, not just what a comfortable commuter expected. Body panels stayed tighter, lower, more aggressive than anything in Opel's existing lineup. Every one of these choices cost money the accountants upstairs hadn't budgeted for a Me Too competitor. Somewhere in that gap between caution and ambition, the real difference between these two cars started taking shape. Ford's Capri had been engineered to never lose the buyers it already had. Opel's Manta was engineered to steal buyers away from someone else entirely, and that single distinction would define almost everything that happened between these two rivals for the next decade. Dealers across Germany, Britain, and beyond had no idea yet which approach would actually win. Nobody inside Rüsselsheim knew for certain either. What they did know, sitting in those tense boardroom sessions through 1969, was that Opel had just committed to a fight it couldn't afford to lose twice. And Ford, still comfortable behind its own sales figures, hadn't even noticed the challenge was coming. Showroom floors across Cologne and Rüsselsheim told two very different stories by 1971, and customers noticed the difference before any brochure explained it to them. Walk into a Ford dealership, and salesmen leaned hard into comfort and status, a car that looked fast without demanding much from the person driving it. Walk into an Opel dealership instead, and the pitch shifted entirely toward feel, toward control, toward a car that rewarded someone who actually wanted to drive, rather than simply be seen. That distinction mattered more than either company's marketing department fully understood at the time. Ford had built the Capri around a buyer-chasing image first, performance second. Opel, still fighting from behind, couldn't win an image contest against a rival with years of head start and a far bigger advertising budget. So the Manta's sales pitch leaned somewhere else entirely, toward the kind of driver who read spec sheets before showroom brochures, who cared about weight distribution more than badge prestige. Privateer racers picked up on that positioning fast, long before official factory teams got involved. Weekend club racers across Germany, Britain, and the Netherlands started entering modified Mantas into local touring car events, chasing exactly the kind of grassroots credibility Ford's more comfortable Capri buyers rarely bothered pursuing. Word moved through these circles quickly. A car built to feel this direct on public roads translated into something genuinely competitive once stripped down for a race weekend. Ford's own engineers watched this happen with a specific kind of discomfort, according to accounts from motoring journalists covering the rivalry closely. Nothing about the Capri's underlying engineering had failed. It still sold in enormous numbers, still dominated volume comparisons across every major European market. What unsettled Cologne wasn't the sales chart. It was the growing sense that Opel had found an audience Ford's own research had never bothered mapping. Buyers who wanted a coupe that argued back a little, that punished a sloppy corner instead of forgiving it. Dealership loyalty split along those same lines, hardening faster than either company expected. Capri owners tended to describe their cars in terms of looks, comfort, and easy livability, the kind of language that sold a car to someone's parents as much as to the driver themselves. Manta owners talked differently. They talked about how the car felt through a specific bend, about a steering response Ford's own engineers had reportedly test-driven themselves, just to understand what all the club racing chatter was actually about. If you've ever picked a side in a rivalry purely because of how something felt rather than what it looked like on paper, you already understand what was happening here. And if this kind of buyer psychology story is exactly what you come here for, hit subscribe now, because the next section digs into the one trait that made this loyalty nearly unbreakable. Something specific was building underneath all of this showroom tension, something neither company's own marketing team had fully planned for or even predicted. Opel hadn't set out to build a cult following. They'd set out to steal sales figures away from a rival with a comfortable head start, using whatever advantage they could actually afford. Along the way, without quite meaning to, they'd built something closer to an identity than a product, a coupe that attracted buyers who cared less about matching their neighbor's car and more about matching their own driving instincts. Ford noticed that shift too, eventually, though not soon enough to fully counter it. Internal correspondence from this period, later referenced by historians covering the rivalry, describes growing unease inside Cologne about a smaller, scrappier competitor building genuine emotional loyalty rather than simple sales volume. Loyalty like that doesn't show up cleanly on a quarterly report. It shows up years later in exactly the kind of stubborn devotion that outlasts a model's own production run. That devotion was about to reveal itself in a way neither company had prepared for, not on a showroom floor and not on a spec sheet, but in the exact character trait that would decide which of these two rivals actually got remembered. Decades separate a showroom floor from a barn find, and almost everything about how the world judged the Manta changed somewhere in that gap. Buyers who once cross-shopped it against a comfortable Capri stopped comparing spec sheets entirely. What replaced that comparison wasn't a magazine test or a sales chart. It was something closer to devotion, the kind that doesn't show up in a company's quarterly numbers but shows up everywhere else instead. Restoration garages across Germany, Britain, and increasingly the United States tell that story better than any press archive could. Mechanics who specialize in caprice will tell you, often without much prompting, that Manta owners behave differently. They don't just want the car running. They want it exactly right. Original steering feel preserved, suspension geometry untouched. Every compromise Opel's engineers refused to make back in 1970, still respected 50 years later by someone who never sat in a single one of those tense boardroom meetings. Consider what that actually represents. Ford built the Capri to protect volume, to stay comfortable enough that nobody crossing a showroom floor felt challenged by it. That strategy worked exactly as designed for years, and it should have guaranteed the Capri's legacy far more securely than any scrappier rival's chances. Yet volume, once the sales stop, doesn't automatically become legend. Comfort rarely does either. Opel's engineers, chasing from behind with a budget nobody upstairs wanted to fully commit to, had no safety net protecting their decision. Every sharper suspension setting, every tighter body panel, every choice that cost more than a Me Too competitor should have needed, carried real risk. A car built purely to answer a rival, with none of that rival's comfortable head start, either finds its own identity or disappears entirely once the sales race ends. The Manta found its identity. That identity outlived the rivalry itself in ways nobody inside either boardroom could have predicted. Motorsport privateers who'd first picked up modified Mantas for weekend club racing kept building on that foundation long after Opel's own factory interest had moved toward newer models. Their word-of-mouth reputation traveled further than any official marketing budget ever managed. It passed between racers and mechanics who cared more about how a car behaved mid-corner than which badge sat on the trunk. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely different from most rivalry stories worth telling. Ford never lost this fight on a spec sheet, and nobody serious argues otherwise. The Capri remained, by nearly every commercial measure, the more successful car for most of its production run. What Ford's caution protected was a broader base of ordinary buyers who wanted comfort more than confrontation. What Opel's obsession created, almost as a side effect of refusing to play it safe, was something narrower and considerably harder to walk away from once you understood it. Auction results in recent years have started reflecting that difference plainly, though not through the kind of headline-grabbing press comparison other rivalries relied on to settle their own arguments. Well-preserved Mantas increasingly draw serious collector attention, often from buyers too young to have ever cross-shopped one against a Capri in an actual 1971 showroom. They're not chasing nostalgia for a rivalry they never witnessed firsthand. They're chasing the specific character that rivalry accidentally produced. Picture what that means for a company that never set out to build a legend in the first place. Opel wanted sales figures. Opel wanted to stop watching Ford dominate every conversation happening in European showrooms. Somewhere in that narrow, defensive, budget-constrained fight, refusing every safe compromise Ford's own team gladly made, they built something that outlasted the very rivalry that forced it into existence. Being built purely to beat Ford, with no cushion of broad appeal to fall back on, should have made the Manta forgettable the moment the sales race ended. Instead, that same narrow, uncompromising focus is exactly why people still argue about it, still restore it, still chase it, decades after the Capri quietly settled into being merely well-remembered. Somewhere right now, a Manta owner is adjusting a suspension setting Ford's engineers never dared risk on the Capri. That refusal never stopped costing Opel sales, and it never stopped earning them believers either. Which rivalry deserves this same treatment next? Drop your pick below, then subscribe.